Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to the Quick Start Guide for Recovery from Addiction and Co-Occurring Disorders. This is Vulnerability, Awareness, and Prevention, Part 1 of 6. I'm your host, Dr. Dawn-Elise Snipes. In this section, we're going to learn about the body's threat response system, otherwise known as the HPA axis, in order to better understand what might be contributing to your continued mood and health problems. So the HPA axis is one of my favorite things to talk about because it is so integral into how we feel emotionally, physically, and a lot of our functioning, including sleep and all that other stuff. Basically, the HPA axis is your threat response system. It works with its buddies, the gut-brain axis and the HPG, or hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, to alter motivation and energy expenditure for survival when there's a perceived threat. Now, the key word here is perceived threat. Sometimes there is an actual threat and your body needs to respond in some way. But sometimes, especially when the threat is based on our thoughts or something, there might not actually be a threat. Our HPA axis, or our threat response system, is designed like a smoke alarm to tell us, hey, there might be a problem. You better check it out. Now, it activates and dumps a bunch of energy to give us the focus and motivation to get up and assess the system and figure out, number one, if there actually is a threat, and then if there is, to do something about it. So it's a great system. When working properly, it provides us the necessary energy to assess and address, if needed, any threats to our survival. So the HPA axis is really a great thing. It is one of the main systems that help us function. So when it's not operating well, we've got a big problem. The HPA axis triggers what I said earlier, the fight or flee response. Now, some people have pointed out that the fight or flee response actually has 4 parts. The fight part, you think you can handle a threat, you're going to fight it. The flee part, you don't think you can handle it, so you want to get away from it. The freeze part, you don't know what to do, and you're kind of like that squirrel stuck in the middle of the road. Or the forget about it part. And, that F can stand for something else. But for this purpose, we'll say forget about it. And when we enter that forget about it stage, we have entered a stage of overactivation and depression where we just don't have the energy to give a crap about anything, about whatever's going on. It's like, yeah, fine, whatever. I just can't at this point. And when we enter that point, we know that our HPA axis is in disarray. It's dysfunctioning because it's been activated for too long and it just can't take anymore. So let's talk about briefly what it does, just so you know. Initially, when we perceive a threat, cortisol, your stress hormone, norepinephrine, your focus hormone, adrenaline, your energy hormone, glutamate, and thyroxine are also energy-related neurotransmitters and hormones. All of those are just dumped into your system. And so you are motivated. You have that burst of energy to get ready to fight or flee. When this happens, it causes the liver to release blood sugar to give you fuel with which to fight or flee. So that's great unless you're diabetic, in which case your diabetes becomes even more difficult to manage because your blood sugar is regularly spiking. So you have all of those excitatory neurochemicals, your turbocharged stuff, as well as your blood sugar floating through the system. So you have all this energy available. At the same time, your calming neurotransmitters like your GABA and some of your serotonin, all of those are downregulated. Now is not the time to relax. Now is not the time to rest and digest. Now is the time to protect yourself in the overall scheme of things. So those things that could help you calm down, those are downregulated. Serotonin. We all know about serotonin as a calming or modulating chemical. Estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone levels are also all altered. It's important to recognize this because that means our ability to relax, our ability to get quality sleep, our ability or our desire to procreate. All of those things are going to be altered when we are in fight, flee, or freeze, or forget about it phase. Because our body's saying we need to devote energy to protecting ourselves, not procreating, definitely not sleeping right now because we need to stay alert to the threat. When all this happens, physically, when the HPA axis is activated for a short term, we actually don't feel as much pain. It's an interesting system that allows us to, fight to protect ourselves and not feel as much pain in the heat of the moment. Our immune system is reduced during this because we're diverting energy away from the immune system to fight or flee. Sleep. It is not time to be unaware when there's a threat, so we're not going to get quality sleep. Digestion. We don't want to spend energy trying to break down foods right now. All the energy is dedicated towards getting rid of whatever that threat that is. Blood pressure, respiration, all that stuff also goes up. It makes sense when you think about why it's happening, but unfortunately, there are some pretty negative side effects from it. Affectively or emotionally, you're going to likely feel anger or anxiety or stress or depression when all this is going on because your body is in that fight or flee. Now's not the time to notice the cute bunny rabbit or to be happy about something. Your body is focused, your brain is focused on addressing or eliminating that threat. Cognitively, you're going to have difficulty concentrating on anything but the perceived threat, which is why your mind may continue to go back to whatever it is that's stressing you out or whatever it is that you're fearful from. And you're going to have alterations in memory and learning because, again, you're focused on the threat. You're not, anything else you're trying to remember or learn is not important in the big scheme of things to your brain at this point in time because there is that looming threat out there. You're also probably going to experience an increase in pessimism. When you're in that fight or flee state, guess what? You are much more aware of all the negative things, the negative stimuli in the environment, and you tend to perceive things from a protective standpoint. So you tend to perceive things through a negative lens, which tends to make you more negative and contribute to increasing your feeling of unsafeness and anxiety and anger. Environmentally and in your relationships, those things are also probably going to change as secondary effects to the fact that you are, not sleeping well, you're not eating, you're in a miserable mood, and you're not able to function and focus on much of anything else. So that is going to impact your environment and your relationships. None of this stuff is stuff we want to have on an ongoing basis. For a short period of time, in the face of an extreme threat, this is a great system. But if it goes on for days, weeks, months, years, not such a good thing. When it's determined that there's no longer a threat, then that HPA axis is downregulated and it sends out what they call inflammatory cytokines or inflammatory messengers that circulate throughout the body and scout for and repair any damage. So after this fight or flight episode is over, that's when you may start feeling more pain. You may start feeling that inflammation, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, my back hurts a little bit now. That's because those inflammatory cytokines are circulating through the system. Unfortunately, if the brain never experiences an all clear, a no threat, or a safe condition, whatever you want to call it, then that HPA axis, that threat response system, stays activated constantly. Think about being on a battleship or even at home with a smoke alarm, and it just goes off all the freaking time. it's going to, eventually start causing a lot of other problems. You're going to get frustrated and irritable, and you're not going to sleep very much if that thing's going off in your ear all the time. Same sort of thing with the HPA axis. If it never experiences an all clear, it stays activated, but because it's designed to protect you, to ensure your survival, it says, you know what? If there's never going to be an all clear, then we can't wait for that in order to repair the system. We've got to repair on the fly. So it starts sending out those inflammatory cytokines throughout your body, even while that threat still exists. So if you're experiencing chronic stress, which is something that can be caused by addiction or depression or anxiety or all of the above, then you may be experiencing that threat state as well as systemic inflammation during that process. So that inflammation is often caused by overactivation of that HPA axis and dysfunction in the immune system. Like receptors do to dopamine in addiction, they become desensitized when they are regularly exposed to that flood of amphetamine or cocaine or whatever it is. And so it takes more cocaine or more of the drug to get the same high. The same thing is true for your stress hormones. At a certain point, those receptors that receive the information that there's a threat out there, eventually they start becoming desensitized. So there has to be more cortisol, more adrenaline, more norepinephrine dumped, which means generally that there's a bigger threat in order to trigger a more extreme reaction, in order to get that system to even really activate. But then when it does, hold on to your horses, because it is an extreme response. You have a much stronger response. And I refer to this when I'm talking to people as the flat to the furious. So generally, you're going along and those receptors aren't as responsive, so you're not getting any excitement, whether it's happy excitement or stress excitement. Those excitatory receptors aren't responding. They're just sitting there going, no. You got to give me something better before I'm actually going to be activated. When there is something that is strong enough to activate them, they are wide open. So that's a little bit different than what happens with in drug tolerance. But the reaction, you go from feeling flat, not being able to feel pleasure or, distress, you're just like, screw it, to really, really, generally really, really angry or really, really anxious. And there's nothing in between. There's no mild irritation. You're either flat or you're enraged. Okay, so that is your intro to how the HPA axis works. The main take-home messages I really want you to get from that is there is a system in your body that responds to threats. And when that system is wonky, for lack of a better clinical term, it causes a lot of problems throughout the system. It's controlling the system. It's sort of the master control. And when it's out of whack, then the whole body system kind of goes offline and starts having problems. So I want you to spend about 45 minutes thinking about the different types of things that exist in your life that trigger that HPA axis to continue to stay activated, to never be able to send that all clear. So in general, there are things in each dimension of PACER that cause stress in the HPA axis. Physically, use or withdrawal, even from process addictions. Anytime you're flooding the brain with the glutamate and the dopamine and the norepinephrine that are released that cause the pleasure from an addictive hit, if you will, that is, overwhelming the system, and the system perceives that as a threat. It's like when, in your house, when you have a surge of electricity and it trips the breaker. Same sort of thing here. So use can trigger a stress response in the body. Withdrawal also triggers a stress response, because once the body gets used to having excess, chemicals coming in, when it's not getting that coming in, then it starts to feel like it's inadequately supplied. Sleep deprivation and circadian rhythm disruption are also huge triggers for the HPA axis, for your threat response system. Your brain and your body feel vulnerable when they are not adequately recharged, when you're not rested, when you're tired. So that causes activation of that HPA axis. Poor nutrition is also perceived as a threat. If you don't have the building blocks to make the hormones and neurotransmitters and tissues necessary to repair and function, then your body perceives that as a threat. It says, hey, we're out of this major needed thing. It can be calcium, it can be vitamin D, it can be protein. There are a variety of things, but poor nutrition does contribute to physical stress. Illnesses, injuries, and pain, including autoimmune issues, are also another group of things that may contribute to physical stress. Affectively, distressful emotions like anger, guilt, resentment, irritation, jealousy, anxious feelings like anxiety, worry, stress, and grief, to name a few, can contribute to HPA axis activation. Anything that's making you feel those distress feelings, those feelings are your body's way of saying there's a threat somewhere. I'm feeling a threat might exist. Might is your key word here. So it's going to be important to go through these feelings and say, all right, what in my life, what is going on right now that is triggering these feelings, and what can I do to address them? Cognitively, as I said, when we're in that state of fear, fight or flight, we tend to not be super optimistic, and that is by design. Our brain wants us to pay attention to the potential other threats in the environment. So we become hypervigilant, we become pessimistic, and that can contribute to seeing the world negatively and feeling even more angry, anxious, etc. A lot of that pessimism can be attributed to what are called cognitive distortions, like all or none thinking, or taking everything overly personally, or engaging in mind reading, assuming you know what other people are thinking. There are a lot of these, and in later units, you're going to learn more about each one of these and ways to address them. But for right now, I want you to start paying attention more to your thinking style, specifically pessimism and negativity, or as you've often heard in recovery circles, stinking thinking, because those things contribute to your brain's perception of threat. Environmentally, unsafeness, and that's a big word, or not a big word, but a big topic for a lot of people, especially if you've experienced trauma. But if you don't feel safe in your skin, if you don't feel safe in your environments, that is going to keep you hypervigilant. That's going to keep that HPA axis triggered. If you've got PTSD, for example, then you are probably perpetually feeling unsafe. And it's going to be important to figure out what you need to do, what you can do to start feeling a little bit safer. It's not going to change overnight, but it is important to recognize that when you don't feel safe, you're not able to relax. You also want to address sensory issues in the environment. Light, lights that are on when you're sleeping, or when it's too dark during the day, or flickering, obnoxious fluorescent lights, that can contribute to stress. Sounds, especially what I call noxious sounds, things that you don't want to hear, even if it's like a low-grade, loud hum, that can add stress to your environment. Yeah, notice I don't say whether it's loud or soft or what it is. Some of us, when I put on my music, I crank it up, and not good for my ears, not recommending you do it, but when I listen to my music, I want it loud. So, what we're looking at here are sounds that are distressful to you. And that can also include abrupt sounds, like when I'm at home and, it's really, really quiet. And then all of a sudden the dogs decide to go berserk over somebody walking down the road. And I've got wood floors and 4 dogs barking and echoing throughout the house. And I feel like I'm going to jump out of my skin. So it's important to just notice some of those things. Any place in this system that you can reduce stress is going to help you feel better. You're not going to be able to address everything at once, but any small positive change is going to have positive ripple effects. And finally, relationally, looking at your relationships. Low self-esteem contributes a lot to HPA axis activation, because when we have low self-esteem, we fear rejection. We are often looking for other people's approval. So there's a constant hypervigilance or hyper-awareness of any sort of microaggression that may indicate disapproval. Working on your self-esteem can be really helpful. Abandonment anxiety. Fearing that people are going to leave you, fearing that you are not going to be loved, fearing that you're not going to have support can contribute to HPA axis activation. And in recovery, especially in early recovery, a lot of times we've done damage to our primary support systems. So there is a heightened sense of abandonment anxiety because we wonder whether we're going to be able to repair these relationships. And finally, just plain old discord in relationships. If you feel taken advantage of or unheard, you feel like nobody takes your opinion into account, or your relationships are characterized by, disagreements and bickering most of the time, that adds distress. That adds stress to your situation. Anytime you're in a relationship and you get angry, guess what? You've triggered that anger again. So for the next 45 minutes or so, because I know this has been a longer narrative than I usually do, but for the next 45 minutes or so, I want you to draw 5 columns. A column for physical, a column for affective, a column for cognitive, a column for environmental, and a column for relational. In each column, identify specific issues that are keeping your threat response system activated. So, in the physical area, for example, maybe you have hepatitis C and that is causing you some problems. It's not under control. Hepatitis C in and of itself is inflammation, and that inflammation is going to trigger the HPA axis. So that may be one of the illnesses, for example, that you have that is contributing to your HPA axis activation. So you're going to go through each column and identify specific issues that you need to address so you can help your body be as healthy as possible, so you can make your environment feel as safe as possible, and so you can improve your relationships, your mood, and your thinking in order to support feelings of happiness and contentment and safety as opposed to those of threat and anxiety. During active addiction and even the post-acute withdrawal period, the HPA axis is often in overdrive. Remember, in post-acute withdrawal, you're not using, but your brain is having to rebalance itself. It's having to repair some of the damage that was done during the active addiction. So that HPA axis is perceiving that there are breakdowns in your physical system, and it is trying to support recovery. But you'll have little spurts here and there of anxiety, spurts of anger that may come out, and that can be the result of that HPA axis not working as effectively as it needs to, and sort of maybe accidentally going off. Just like a smoke alarm can sometimes go off for no reason at all. And you're like, really? What was that about? A crucial aspect of emotion regulation and physical recovery involves restoring the HPA axis functioning by creating safety, and reducing assaults to the system like dopamine and adrenaline surges from addictive behaviors, poor nutrition, and sleep dysfunction.